Hello everyone, I am Midnight Whisper, and I'm here to unravel the threads of the unseen, to shine a faint light into the shadowed corners of our world, and to ask you a simple, unsettling question. Have you ever felt a presence in an empty room? A subtle shift in the air, a shadow that seems too deep, too still. Tonight, we explore the unsettling truth that some things don't just exist in the dark, they are the dark, and they've been watching you longer than you think. For 15 years, Ray Carlson had considered himself a rational man. His graveyard shift at Meridian Industrial Supply suited him. Fewer people, fewer complications. He patrolled the sprawling 90,000 square foot warehouse, a grid of metal shelving, lumber, and piping, where the typical creaks and groans of a settling building were his only companions. He was adept at distinguishing mundane sounds from anything requiring attention. But 3 weeks ago, something changed. The night was unseasonably cold for September, a thin fog clinging to the industrial park. Ray was midway through his second patrol when he heard them. Footsteps. Not the hollow sounds of the building contracting, but deliberate footfalls, the unmistakable shift of weight from heel to toe. They echoed from the eastern corridor, where specialty, cement, and insulation were stored. Nobody should have been there at 2:17 a.m. His first thought was a forgotten colleague, but he'd locked up himself. The alarm system was undisturbed. His second thought, less comforting, was intruders. He radioed security. The remote operator confirmed no entry alerts, no motion sensor trips. He was entirely alone. The eastern section was poorly lit, even during the day, with high shelving creating deep caverns of shadow. Ray switched on his heavy-duty flashlight, its beam cutting the darkness like a knife. "Security, identify yourself." His voice sounded thinner than he intended. The footsteps stopped. His light swept down the corridor, illuminating stacks of pink insulation and pallets of concrete mix. At the far end, perhaps 60 feet away, his light caught something. A silhouette, motionless, dark, its edges seeming to blur into the shadows behind it. He couldn't make out features, just a vaguely human shape, watching. His heart hammered as adrenaline surged. "This is private property," he called, trying to sound authoritative despite the tremor in his voice. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, considering him. Ray walked towards it, flashlight beam fixed, though the light seemed to bend strangely around the silhouette, never quite illuminating it directly. Each step required more effort, as if wading through invisible molasses. When he was 20 feet away, the figure was simply gone. Not like someone who ducked or ran. There was nowhere to go. It was as if it had been absorbed into the darkness itself. He searched every aisle, every possible hiding spot. Nothing. The building was secure. Later that night, reviewing security footage, he saw nothing in the corridor when he'd entered. No silhouette. But the cameras did capture something else. Brief, almost subliminal distortions passing in front of each camera in sequence, like someone moving just fast enough to register as motion, but not slow enough to be clearly seen. The timestamps showed these anomalies occurring throughout the building, sometimes in areas he just left, sometimes in areas he was about to enter. He convinced himself it was a technical glitch, a malfunction. There had to be a logical explanation. But then, 2 nights later, it happened again. In the break room, microwaving a frozen dinner, the fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. The microwave's digital display reset itself, blinking 12 o'clock. And he felt it, a pressure change, as if the air had suddenly become denser. The hair on his arms stood up, and he had the distinct, visceral sensation of being watched. Slowly, he turned. Nothing was there. But the hallway beyond seemed darker than it should have been, as if the shadows had condensed into something more substantial. He abandoned his meal and spent the next hour checking every corner of the facility. Everything was secure. Everything was normal. And yet, nothing felt normal anymore. Over the following weeks, the incidents escalated in frequency and intensity. Ray began finding objects moved between his rounds, a clipboard on one shelf appearing on another, tools arranged in specific patterns he didn't create. Once, he returned to the security office to find every monitor displaying the same empty corridor, though he was certain he'd left them cycling through different areas. He started documenting everything, a detailed log of times, locations, and sensations. The pattern that emerged was unsettling. The phenomena clustered around 3:15 a.m., initially focused in the eastern corridor but gradually spreading throughout the warehouse. And they always seemed to anticipate his movements, occurring in areas shortly before he arrived. The physical manifestations of his fear became impossible to ignore. His resting heart rate increased. He developed insomnia that persisted even on his days off, jolting awake from half-remembered nightmares, convinced that a silhouette stood in the corner of his bedroom, watching. His appetite disappeared, and with it, 15 pounds in 3 weeks. His supervisor noticed the change, commenting on the dark circles under his eyes, the trembling of his hands. Ray almost told him everything about the footsteps, the silhouette, the displaced objects, but he could already imagine the reaction. Stress, sleep deprivation, professional help. Maybe he should have. Instead, he decided to confront whatever was happening. He brought in additional equipment from home, a digital audio recorder, a thermal imaging attachment for his phone, motion-activated trail cameras. He set them up in the eastern corridor and other hot spots. For 2 nights, nothing happened. The warehouse was quiet, normal. He began to wonder if his mind had manufactured the entire experience, if stress and isolation had finally caught up. Then came last night. Ray was in the security office reviewing camera feeds when the power went out. Emergency lights kicked on, bathing the corridors in a dim, reddish glow. Following protocol, he grabbed his flashlight and radio, heading to the main breaker panel in the basement. He'd always disliked the basement, low ceiling, narrow, twisting pathways, but he'd never feared it. Until last night. As he descended, his flashlight beam seemed to penetrate less deeply into the darkness, as if the shadows had become thicker, more resistant. The temperature dropped noticeably with each step, his breath forming clouds in the increasingly frigid air. The silence was absolute. No hum of electricity, no distant traffic sounds. Just his boots on concrete and his increasingly shallow breathing. He reached the breaker panel, finding it untouched, no tripped circuits. As he examined it, his radio crackled to life. Through bursts of static, he heard what sounded like breathing. Slow, deliberate breaths, as if someone were standing very close to a transmitter. "This is Carlson," he said into the radio. "Who's there?" The breathing continued for several seconds, then stopped. The static cleared, and then he heard his own voice coming through the speaker, repeating words he'd spoken earlier that night during a routine check-in. All clear in Section 4, moving to Section 5. A cold weight settled in his stomach. He switched off the radio, fighting the urge to run. He needed to return to the security office to check if anyone had entered during the blackout. That's when he heard the footsteps again. Not from the radio, but from somewhere in the basement. Unhurried, deliberate, moving toward him. His flashlight flickered, dimmed, then brightened again. He swept its beam toward the sound, illuminating stacks of old lumber, discarded display racks. The footsteps stopped. He held his breath. Nothing. Then, A sound directly behind him, the soft scuff of a shoe on concrete. He spun around, heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his fingertips. His light caught something at the edge of its beam, that same dark silhouette, now much closer than it had ever been before. Still featureless, still indistinct, but undeniably present. Fear paralyzed him. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His light flickered again, and in that momentary darkness, he felt something cold brush against his cheek, light as a breath, but deliberate as a caress. When the light stabilized, the silhouette was gone. But on the wall beside him, where nothing had been before, he saw a handprint, not made of dust or dirt, but of absence, as if someone had pressed their palm against the concrete and somehow extracted all color and texture from that exact spot, leaving a perfect void in the shape of a hand. He didn't remember running up the stairs, didn't remember locking himself in the security office, but he remembered the cameras coming back online, one by one, each showing normal, empty corridors. And he remembered the timestamp on each feed, 3:15 a.m. Ray called in sick today, the first time in 7 years. He's sitting in his apartment, all lights on, typing this account. Because he needs to understand. Because he needs someone to know. The trail cameras and audio recorders are still in the warehouse. He should go back tonight, to retrieve them, to see if they captured anything. The rational part of him, the part that's shrinking by the hour, says there will be a logical explanation for everything. A prankster, a malfunction, his own overtaxed imagination. But another part of him knows different, because when he finally left the warehouse this morning, as dawn broke over the industrial park, he checked his pockets for his car keys and found something else instead. A small, smooth stone he'd never seen before, and when he held it up to the light, he saw that it wasn't a stone at all, but a perfect cube of concrete, its surface bearing the faint impression of fingerprints that don't match his own. What's waiting for Ray Carlson in that warehouse? And how long has whatever has been watching him from the shadows truly been there? Perhaps it's been there all along, in the peripheral shadows of his life, waiting for him to finally notice. And now that he has, it's noticed him too. The subtle whispers that begin in the periphery often find their way into our most private spaces. Your home is your fortress, your sanctuary from the world, or so you thought. What if the walls themselves held secrets? What if the sounds you dismiss as an old building settling were, in fact, something far more sinister, waiting just beyond your sight? Tonight, we delve into the intimate horror of domestic invasion, where the comfort of one's personal sanctuary is shattered by unseen forces, transforming familiar walls into sources of dread. Do your walls whisper secrets? Do the creaks and groans of your home resonate with an unease you can't quite explain? First, consider the case of a young man who, 3 months ago, found what he thought was the perfect apartment. Gleaming hardwood floors, pristine white walls, modern fixtures, all recently renovated. The landlord, Mr. Harmon, a thin man with perpetually damp palms, had proudly detailed how he'd gutted the entire unit, replacing everything that needed replacing. But 2 weeks in, the peace was shattered. At precisely 2:03 a.m., a distinct gurgling sound began. Not the normal flow of water, but something irregular, almost rhythmic, coming from inside the wall behind his headboard. It seemed to move, flowing from one section of wall to another, following a path that made no logical sense for plumbing. Every night, at the same time, for exactly 17 minutes. When he contacted Mr. Harmon, the landlord was dismissive, muttering about air trapped in new pipes, eager to end the call. But the gurgling persisted. Then, 3 weeks into his tenancy, came the tapping. As he pressed his ear to the wall, tracking the liquid sounds, he felt a gentle vibration. Tap, tap, tap. Asterisk, 3 distinct vibrations. He responded with 3 taps of his own. The gurgling stopped. Then, from deeper within the wall, came 5 distinct taps. Slow, deliberate, unmistakably responsive. Direct communication. He froze, paralyzed. He called a friend over, but the entity remained silent. Then, one night, he woke to find every light in his apartment on, from lamps to the oven light, all glowing at once. In the sudden harsh brightness, he saw it. A subtle discoloration on his bedroom wall, a long vertical seam where the fresh paint didn't quite match. As the gurgling began, he placed his palm flat against the seam. It was unnaturally warm, and beneath his palm, a continuous tremor, as if something on the other side was pressing back. He snatched his hand away, but the sensation lingered. Driven by a primal need to know, he found a hammer. The first strike broke through the drywall easily. What he saw was not insulation or standard pipes, but old, corroded copper tubes, wrapped in something dark, organic, that pulsed faintly with the gurgling sound, and woven through it, something that resembled wiring but moved. He stumbled backward as a low, wet rasp like labored breathing joined the gurgling. The wall began to bulge outward around the hole, stretching as if the drywall had become elastic. Something was pushing through, a shape suggesting fingers. He didn't wait. He ran, fumbling with the locks. Behind him, he heard drywall tearing, something heavier than liquid hitting the floor. His landlord's response to his frantic texts was chilling. "Told you I replaced everything that needed replacing. Not my fault you disturbed what didn't." He never returned. But sometimes, in his new apartment in a different city, he still wakes at 2:03 a.m., listening. And sometimes, he hears the distant sound of liquid flowing where it shouldn't, of something tapping gently, patiently, waiting for him to answer back. Next, we turn to a house that defied its charming facade. It was a Victorian house, creaking and settling, but on the third night, a faint, persistent scratching began from the attic. Fingernails against wood, or something sharper. The landlord, Mr. Hargrove, had been unusually adamant about the attic being off-limits. The heavy wooden doors sealed with industrial padlocks and strange painted symbols. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, too methodical for rodents, too heavy for wildlife. It moved like something dragging itself with laborious determination. Then, a muffled exhalation, a long rattling breath from something with compromised lungs. Miss Hargrove, when called, dismissed it as wind, his voice hardening when the attic was mentioned. A friend, Mark, witnessed the sounds, confirming the chilling reality. Together, they examined the attic door. Deep gouges marred the wood around the frame, and the symbols were halfway between hieroglyphics and mathematical notations. The hinges were heavily reinforced. "These weren't installed to keep people out," Mark muttered. "They were installed to keep something in." A crash from above made them jump. That night, the noises escalated, dragging, scratching, and now a rhythmic thumping, like a fist pounding in frustration, or a head banging against the floor. At midnight, a terrifying silence fell. Then, a new sound from the hallway outside his bedroom, a slow, dragging step, followed by the distinct sound of labored breathing, a soft thud against his door, as if something had pressed itself against the wood. The handle slowly turned, testing the lock, a soft scratching at the keyhole. Just then, his phone rang. It was Mark. "Get out of there now," he urged, his voice tight with fear. He'd researched the house. In 1897, the original owner, Theodore Blackwood, had been committed to an asylum after claiming something he'd accidentally summoned through occult experiments had taken residence in his attic. He'd sealed it in with binding symbols. Every owner or tenant since had reported similar disturbances. 3 had committed suicide. 2 disappeared without a trace. The house had been vacant for most of the last 20 years. Hanging up, he saw them. The padlocks. All 3 lay open on the floor. The attic door stood ajar, just a few inches, but enough to reveal absolute darkness beyond. He pushed it wider. The hinges screamed, bending outward. The frame splintered. It hadn't been opened from the outside. It had been broken open from within. His flashlight caught a swift withdrawal of something pale and emaciated at the top of the stairs. A sound like wet meat slapping against wood. A putrid combination of rot, ammonia, and something metallic filled the air, mixed with old paper, ink, and candle wax. A low, guttural sound, halfway between a growl and speech. The temperature plummeted. He glimpsed a pale, elongated limb, fingers too numerous, joints too flexible to be human, reaching around the doorframe. He fled, never to return. But weeks later, a small package arrived from Mr. Hargrove. Inside, a single key and a handwritten note. It knows your scent now. It may follow. If it does, use this on any door in your home and keep that door sealed. May God forgive me. He threw the key away and moved to another state, but sometimes, at night, he still hears the scratching, faint but persistent, from the ceiling above his bed. And sometimes, in the darkest hours, he hears something dragging itself slowly across the floor of the vacant apartment above him. If our homes can betray us, what happens when the inexplicable seeps into the public spaces we navigate every day? The gyms, the hotels, the places designed for community. What happens when they become stages for an unseen play, with you as the unwitting star? From the sterile hum of a hotel hallway to the echoing splash of an empty pool, public spaces often feel anonymous, safe. But what if they're not? What if these shared places hold more than just memories, but active, malevolent presences that choose to reveal themselves when you least expect it? The walls of the Belmont Hotel had absorbed 70 years of whispers. I noticed it immediately, that particular silence old buildings have, where the quiet itself feels heavy, charged with all it's holding back. My footsteps on the worn burgundy carpet echoed down the third-floor corridor. Each step absorbed into the stillness like a stone dropped into thick mud. Room 307 waited at the end of the hallway, its brass numbers dulled with age. I had chosen this place for its location and its price, not its charm. That was my first mistake. The key was an actual metal key, not a card. Another relic of the hotel's refusal to fully join the present century. It turned with resistance in the lock, as if the door itself was reluctant to allow entry. The room smelled of furniture polish and something else beneath it, a musty thickness that hung in the air like invisible smoke. Nothing remarkable at first glance. A queen bed with a faded floral comforter, heavy drapes drawn against the streetlights, a desk with a lamp casting a shallow yellow pool across its surface. Just another forgettable room, in another forgettable hotel, in another city I was passing through for work. I unpacked methodically, as I always did. Routine calms me. I travel 40 weeks a year selling industrial equipment across 6 states. Hotel rooms are more familiar to me than my own apartment. I know their rhythms, their peculiarities. I can tell within minutes whether the shower will run hot, whether the air conditioning will rattle all night, whether the walls will allow me to hear every intimate detail of my neighbors' lives. But the Belmont felt different from the start. Not just old I could handle, but aware somehow. I dismissed this thought as exhaustion from the 6-hour drive and ordered dinner from a nearby Thai place. Ate at the desk while reviewing tomorrow's presentation, showered, called my girlfriend back home, telling her about the eccentric old hotel with its elaborate crown molding and creaking floors. We laughed about how places like these were probably haunted. Her voice tinny through the phone speakers. I didn't mention how the silence in the room pressed against my eardrums when I wasn't speaking, or how the shadows seemed unusually deep in the corners where the ceiling light couldn't reach. Sleep came easily enough. The day's travel is sufficient sedative. I woke disoriented at 3:17 a.m. My throat parched. The digital clock's red numbers cast the only light in the absolute darkness of the room. Something had woken me, though I couldn't identify what. I reached for the water bottle on the nightstand, finding it empty. With a sigh, I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the floor cold against my bare feet. That's when I heard it. A voice, low and indistinct, like someone speaking just below normal conversational volume. It seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby, not my room, but close. The wall shared with room 309, perhaps? I froze, water forgotten, straining to make out words. The cadence was conversational, rising and falling as if in dialogue, though I could hear only one voice. I couldn't distinguish gender or age, just a continuous murmur that occasionally peaked into almost comprehensible phrases before subsiding again. My skin prickled with goosebumps despite the room's warmth. Something about that voice felt wrong. The tone, perhaps, or the hour, or the fact that it never paused for response. After several minutes, curiosity overcame discomfort. I pulled on sweatpants and moved to the door, pressing my ear against it. The voice was clearer in the entryway, definitely coming from the hallway or the adjacent room. I turned the handle slowly, wincing at the slight creak as I pulled the door open an inch, then wider. The hallway stretched empty in both directions, the dim safety lights creating pools of yellowish illumination every 15 feet. The worn carpet runner absorbed sound, creating a vacuum-like silence. But the voice continued, now seeming to emanate from directly beside my door, from room 309. I stepped fully into the corridor, the door clicking shut behind me. My heart rate accelerated, each beat a distinct thump against my ribs. The voice grew neither louder nor clearer despite my proximity. I approached room 309, standing directly before it. The murmuring continued at exactly the same volume, as if the speaker remained at a constant distance regardless of my movement. I raised my hand to knock, then hesitated. It was nearly 3:30 a.m. What business did I have disturbing another guest? What would I even say? Yet something compelled me to knock softly, my knuckles barely making contact with the wooden door. The voice stopped immediately. Complete silence descended, broken only by my increasingly shallow breathing. I waited, seconds stretching uncomfortably. No answer came. No sounds of movement within. Nothing to indicate anyone had heard me at all. I retreated to my room, the back of my neck tingling with the distinct sensation of being watched. Sleep eluded me for hours afterward, my body alert to every creak and settle of the old building. The voice did not resume that night. Morning brought rationality with its light. I dismissed the incident as a guest with insomnia having a late-night phone conversation. The peculiar acoustics of the old hotel had simply made it difficult to pinpoint the source. At breakfast, in the small hotel dining room, I casually asked the receptionist about the occupancy on the third floor. She consulted her computer, then informed me that aside from my room, the entire third floor was unoccupied due to ongoing renovations at the far end of the hall. A cold sensation spread across my shoulder blades. I asked specifically about room 309. She checked again, confirming it was vacant and had been for several weeks. I must have heard someone from another floor, she suggested, or perhaps sounds from the street. The building is old, and sound travels strangely. Her explanation was practical, delivered with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to smoothing over guests' concerns. I nodded and thanked her, but a seed of unease had been planted. Throughout my meetings that day, my mind kept returning to that murmuring voice in the empty room it supposedly came from. I considered requesting a room change, but dismissed the thought as an overreaction. One unexplained voice in the night hardly justified disrupting my stay. Besides, I told myself it was probably just someone in another room, or even outside. Old buildings play tricks with sound. That night, I returned late from dinner with clients. The Belmont's lobby was dimly lit, the ancient chandelier casting prismatic shadows across the worn marble floor. The night clerk nodded as I crossed to the elevator, his eyes barely lifting from his computer screen. The elevator's brass gate closed with a metallic clang that echoed up the shaft. As I ascended, I felt an increasing heaviness in my chest, an inexplicable reluctance to return to the third floor. The corridor was silent when I stepped out. I walked briskly to room 307, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Inside, I prepared for bed with deliberate normality. I placed a full water bottle on the nightstand, eliminating any need to leave the room during the night. Before turning off the light, I checked that the door was securely locked, testing the handle twice. Sleep came fitfully, my subconscious alert for unusual sounds. I woke several times to ordinary hotel noises, the hum of the heating system, distant doors closing, water running through pipes. At 2:43 a.m., I jerked fully awake. The voice had returned. This time, it was louder, clearly emanating from the hallway directly outside my door. No longer a murmur, but an urgent, insistent monologue, still indistinct in its words, but unmistakable in its presence. I lay rigid in bed, cold sweat beading across my forehead. My mouth dried instantly, my tongue sticking to the roof of my mouth. Every muscle tensed as I strained to understand what was being said. The voice continued unabated for several minutes, rising and falling in its intensity, but never resolving into comprehensible language. It was neither male nor female, but somehow both simultaneously, its tone shifting between what seemed like pleading and explaining. I fought the overwhelming urge to cover my ears, to block out that persistent, unintelligible speech. Against all better judgment, I slid from bed and approached the door. The room's chill air raised goosebumps across my arms as I pressed my eye to the peephole. The distorted fisheye view showed an empty hallway. Impossible! The voice was directly outside, so close it might have been speaking into the very door itself. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. Logic warred with instinct. There was no explanation for a disembodied voice, yet my senses insisted on its reality. The metal knob felt impossibly cold against my palm. I turned it slowly, pulling the door open a crack. The hallway was empty, yet the voice continued uninterrupted, now seeming to come from the space directly before me where no one stood. My vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in as my breathing became rapid and shallow. The physical impossibility of what I was experiencing sent pulses of adrenaline surging through my body. I slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock, then backed away until my legs hit the bed. The voice stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was almost worse, expectant, as if waiting for me to make the next move. I sat motionless on the edge of the bed, ears straining for any sound. Minutes passed. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I fell into troubled sleep shortly before dawn. At breakfast, I approached the front desk with as much composure as I could muster. The day clerk was an older man, with weary eyes and thinning gray hair. When I mentioned hearing voices on the third floor, his expression shifted subtly from professional courtesy to guarded recognition. I pressed further, asking directly if other guests had reported similar experiences. He hesitated before admitting that, yes, over the years, there had been occasional reports of voices in the hallways, particularly on the third floor, most often in the small hours of the morning, always seemingly engaged in one-sided conversations that never resolved. He delivered this information reluctantly, watching my reaction carefully, as if gauging whether he'd shared too much. I asked if he knew what the voices were saying. His response was evasive. No one had ever been able to make out specific words, only the impression of urgent communication. The phenomenon had been occurring for decades, long before his employment. The hotel management generally attributed it to the building's acoustic peculiarities and its location near a hospital where ambulance sirens and emergency room activity continued through the night. His explanation was reasonable, but delivered with the practiced ease of something repeated many times. I noticed he didn't meet my eyes as he spoke. When I mentioned that the voice seemed to be directly outside my door where no one stood, he fell silent, busying himself with papers on the desk. After a moment, he asked if I would like to change rooms. I accepted immediately. My new room was on the first floor, smaller but renovated more recently. I spent the day distracted, researching the Belmont's history between meetings. The hotel had opened in 1932 and operated continuously since, changing ownership several times. Nothing in its public history suggested tragedy or circumstances that might explain supernatural activity. Yet, online review sites contained scattered comments about strange noises and talking in the hallways that the management consistently attributed to the building's age and sound-carrying properties. That night, I slept soundly in my new room, undisturbed by voices or other phenomena. The following night passed similarly. By my final night at the Belmont, I had nearly convinced myself that my experience had been some combination of exhaustion, the building's acoustics, and my own suggestibility. As I checked out the next morning, the night clerk, who was finishing his shift, handed me my receipt. He commented that I seemed to have slept better after changing rooms. I agreed, adding that the third floor had been unsettling. A shadow passed across his features. He glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot before leaning slightly closer. What he told me was brief but sufficient to ensure I would never return to the Belmont. He claimed that in the 1952nd, a traveling salesman, like myself, had stayed in room 309 for several weeks. The man had suffered from what would now be diagnosed as schizophrenia, manifesting as endless one-sided conversations with entities no one else could perceive. Hotel staff had become concerned when other guests complained, but the hotel's owner refused to evict a paying customer who wasn't violent. Eventually, the man had been found in a catatonic state, staring at the wall shared with room 307. He never spoke again and spent his remaining years in a psychiatric institution. Before being taken away, he had managed to write a single sentence on a piece of hotel stationery. There, still waiting for an answer. I left the Belmont that morning with my bags, and a persistent chill that no amount of sunlight seemed to dispel. In the week since, I've changed hotel chains entirely, avoiding historic properties regardless of their convenient locations or competitive rates. I've convinced my employer to book only modern accommodations with concrete and steel construction rather than the wood and plaster of older buildings. Sometimes at night, just as I'm drifting off to sleep, I imagine I hear that voice again, urgent, insistent, just beyond comprehension. I tell myself it's memory playing tricks, nothing more. But I always sleep with music playing now, filling the silence with something known and human. And I never, ever answer if I think I hear someone speaking outside my door after midnight, because whatever was in that hallway, whatever has been trying to communicate through the thin barrier between its reality and ours, is still waiting for someone to answer. And I fear what might happen when someone finally does. The chlorine smell hits differently at night. During the day, it's normal, expected even, mingling with the sounds of splashing and laughter. But at 2 a.m., when the building should be empty, that chemical scent hanging in the still air becomes something else entirely. Something invasive. Something wrong. And when I hear water moving in an empty pool, the smell intensifies, as if responding to my fear. I've been the night custodian at Westfield Community Sports Center for nearly 7 years now. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills and suits my preference for solitude. The center itself is a relic from the 1972nd, a sprawling concrete structure with dated wood paneling, flickering fluorescent lights, and that particular musty odor, unique to places where thousands of sweaty bodies have passed through over decades. My shift begins at 10 p.m. after the last patrons and staff have left. I clean the weight room, sweep the basketball courts, mop the locker rooms, and ensure everything is ready for the morning crowd. Most nights are uneventful. Just me and my cleaning cart moving through the empty building, my footsteps echoing against the walls. I've grown accustomed to the various sounds an old building makes at night, the settling of foundations, the hum of vending machines, the occasional rattling in the ventilation system. But the pool area has always been different. The indoor pool is housed in its own wing, a large, glass-roofed space with poor acoustics and perpetual humidity. Even during busy hours, voices echo strangely in there, distorted by the water and tile surfaces. At night, that echo effect seems to intensify, as if the space itself is somehow larger in the darkness. The first incident happened about 3 months after I started. I was passing by the pool entrance around midnight when I heard what sounded like someone doing laps, the rhythmic splash of arms cutting through water, the distinct sound of someone coming up for air. I froze, convinced we had an after-hours trespasser. It wouldn't be the first time. Some teenagers had found a way to sneak in for a midnight swim. When I pushed open the heavy double doors, the splashing immediately stopped. I hit the light switch, illuminating the vast space in harsh fluorescent light. The water surface was completely still, a perfect blue mirror reflecting the ceiling. No ripples, no movement, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I searched the entire area, checking bathroom stalls, looking behind equipment, even examining the emergency exits for signs of forced entry. Nothing. Security hadn't reported any breaches, and the building's old but functional alarm system hadn't been triggered. I convinced myself I'd imagined it, or perhaps heard water moving through the pipes. Old buildings make strange sounds, after all. But it happened again 2 weeks later. This time, the splashing was more frantic, like someone thrashing in the water. I rushed in faster, heart hammering against my ribs, certain I'd find someone in trouble. Again, nothing. Just that impossibly still water and the overpowering smell of chlorine that seemed to cling to my clothes for hours afterward. Management brushed off my concerns when I mentioned it. The building manager, a perpetually exhausted man named Taylor, suggested it was probably just the filtration system cycling on. The maintenance supervisor theorized that temperature changes at night caused the water to expand and contract, creating sounds. Both explanations seemed reasonable, and I wanted to believe them. For a while, I avoided the pool area during my shifts. I'd speed through my cleaning duties there early in the evening and find reasons to stay in other parts of the building during the later hours. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I began lingering near the entrance, listening for those sounds, almost hoping to hear them again so I could prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. On a particularly cold Tuesday in November, I got my wish. The splashing was unmistakable, loud enough that it sounded like an entire swim team practicing relays. I didn't immediately rush in this time. Instead, I pressed my ear against the door, listening to the rhythmic sounds, trying to detect any pattern or explanation. Then came a new sound, a low, gurgling moan that raised the hair on my arms and sent ice through my veins. I backed away from the door, my heart thundering in my chest. My first instinct was to leave, to call security or even the police. But I knew what they would find. Nothing. Just like every other time. Whatever was happening in there, it seemed visible or audible only to me. That night I went home and researched the history of the sports center. The building had been constructed in 1974, renovated twice since then, but the pool area remained largely unchanged. There were no newspaper reports of drownings or accidents, no tragic stories that might explain what I was experiencing. The place had an unremarkable history, just decades of swim lessons, water aerobics classes, and community events. The following week, I brought a digital recorder with me. If I couldn't see anything unusual, perhaps I could at least capture the sounds. I set it up near the pool entrance around 11:30 p.m. and continued with my cleaning duties elsewhere. When I retrieved it an hour later, my hands were shaking so badly I could hardly press the playback button. The recording contained nothing but static, and the occasional sound of the building's heating system cycling on. No splashing, no moaning. Nothing to validate what I'd been hearing. I began to seriously question my sanity. Was I experiencing auditory hallucinations? Was the isolation of night shifts finally getting to me after years? I even scheduled an appointment with my doctor, who found nothing physically wrong, but suggested I might be experiencing stress-induced sensory anomalies. He recommended a psychiatrist, but I never followed through with the referral. Instead, I became obsessed with proving what I heard was real. I installed a small personal security camera aimed at the pool, camouflaged among the safety equipment on the wall. It was technically against company policy, but my need for answers outweighed potential consequences. For 3 nights, the camera recorded nothing unusual, just an empty pool area with occasional shadows cast by passing clouds over the glass ceiling. On the 4th night, everything changed. The footage began normally, the still pool illuminated by the dim emergency lighting. At 1:17 a.m., the surface of the water began to ripple slightly from the center outward, as if disturbed by a gentle touch. The ripples increased in intensity until the entire pool appeared to be churning, water sloshing against the edges. And yet there was no visible cause. No object, no person, nothing falling from above. Just the water itself moving as if alive. At 1:22 a.m., the camera's image became distorted, the screen filling with static. When the picture cleared 10 seconds later, the pool was completely still again. The timestamp showed no skip in recording. Whatever had happened, the camera had captured it or tried to. I watched the footage over and over, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. This was proof, evidence that something was happening in that pool, something that defied logical explanation. That same night, I made the decision to confront whatever was in there. I waited until 1 a.m. when the building was at its quietest. I entered the pool area, leaving the lights off except for my flashlight. The chlorine smell hit me immediately, stronger than usual, almost eye-watering in its intensity. I called out, my voice echoing against the tile walls. I asked if anyone was there, feeling immediately foolish for speaking to an empty room. The water remained still, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like black glass. For nearly 20 minutes I stood there, waiting, listening. Nothing happened. No movement. No sound. I began to wonder if the phenomenon was somehow aware of my intentions, if it was hiding from my scrutiny. As I turned to leave, defeated and questioning my investigation, the sound began. Not splashing this time, but a slow, rhythmic dripping, like water falling from a great height into the pool, drop by drop. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but saw nothing. The dripping continued, growing faster, more insistent, until it became a steady stream. A wave of dizziness washed over me. The smell of chlorine became overwhelming, filling my lungs, making it difficult to breathe. The beam of my flashlight dimmed, the batteries seemingly draining in real time. In the fading light, I saw the water begin to move, not in ripples or waves, but rising upward in a column from the center of the pool. I backed away, unable to process what I was seeing. The column grew taller, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. A head, shoulders, arms forming from liquid that somehow maintained its form outside the confines of the pool. My back hit the wall, and I realized I had nowhere to run. My legs refused to move, frozen in primal terror as the water figure drifted toward the edge of the pool nearest to me. It had no face, no features, just a suggestion of human form composed entirely of pool water. Yet somehow I felt it watching me, studying me with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. The chlorine smell became mixed with something else, something older and more organic, like algae or river mud. My chest constricted as I struggled to breathe. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. I was certain I was about to lose consciousness when the overhead light suddenly blazed to life. The water figure collapsed instantly, splashing back into the pool with a sound like a body falling from height. I looked toward the door and saw Taylor, the building manager, his hand still on the light switch, staring at me with concern and confusion. He wanted to know what I was doing in the dark, why I looked so terrified. I couldn't form coherent words, could only point toward the pool that was now perfectly still under the harsh fluorescent lights. Taylor checked the time nearly 3 a.m. and suggested I'd fallen asleep on the job, perhaps had a nightmare. The explanation was almost appealing in its normalcy, and I nearly accepted it. But then I noticed the puddle of water at my feet, several yards away from the pool's edge. Water that couldn't have splashed this far. Water that smelled not of chlorine, but of river mud. Taylor saw it too. He frowned, asking if I'd spilled something. When he knelt to touch it, I wanted to stop him, wanted to scream at him not to make contact with it. The liquid seemed to recoil from his fingers, sliding away across the tile in defiance of gravity before disappearing into a nearby drain. I quit that night, handed Taylor my keys, mumbled something about health issues, and never returned to collect my final paycheck. He didn't try to convince me to stay, just gave me an odd, evaluating look before nodding slowly, as if confirming something to himself. It's been 6 months since I left the Westfield Community Sports Center. I found other workday shifts only, and mostly convinced myself that stress and isolation were responsible for my experiences. Almost 2 weeks ago, I received a small package in the mail. No return address, just my name and apartment number. Inside was a USB drive containing a single video file. Security footage from the pool area, dated 3 days after my departure. The familiar scene of the empty pool at night, the water beginning to move with no apparent cause. But this footage continued longer than mine had. The water rose, formed its humanoid shape, and then changed. Features appeared in the watery form, a face taking shape, eyes opening, mouth moving as if speaking words the camera couldn't capture. It was my face looking back from that watery body. The video ended there, replaced by a text document containing just 3 sentences. The pool has always remembered those who fear it. It collects their reflections, their impressions left on the water. Sometimes, it gives them back. I've moved twice since receiving that package. I avoid all bodies of water larger than a bathtub. I don't swim, don't visit beaches, don't walk near lakes or rivers. I've installed waterproof cameras throughout my apartment, focused especially on bathroom drains and faucets. At night, I often wake to the sound of distant splashing, though there's no water source nearby that could explain it. Sometimes the air in my bedroom smells faintly of chlorine, a scent that now sends me into immediate panic. The worst part isn't the fear of what might be following me. It's the growing sense that whatever is haunting me isn't some external entity from that pool. The real horror is the possibility that part of me never left that building, that some essential piece of my consciousness was somehow extracted and now exists separately, trapped in water, trying to find its way back to me, or perhaps trying to replace me entirely. Every mirror I pass, every reflective surface, shows me myself. But sometimes, just for a moment, my reflection seems to move independently, its expression slightly out of sync with my own. A subtle wrongness that vanishes when I look directly at it, but returns in my peripheral vision. I don't know how long I can continue living this way, jumping at the sound of running water, avoiding rain, suspecting my own reflection of malevolent intent. But I know one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever began in that pool isn't finished with me. And sometimes, in my darkest moments of doubt, I wonder if I'm still there, standing at the edge of that pool in the middle of the night, hallucinating this entire life as my body slowly drowns, pulled under by something that has waited decades for company. The thought almost makes me hope that the splashing sounds I hear coming closer each night will finally reach me, if only to confirm which version of reality is true. The first time I saw it, I convinced myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the flickering fluorescent bulb that had been threatening to die for weeks. But deep down, I knew. In that decrepit basement locker room, with its perpetual dampness and the subtle scent of mildew that no amount of industrial cleaner could mask, something had found me. And now, it wouldn't let me go. Downtown's elite fitness center was anything but elite. Housed in a pre-war building with creaking floors and walls that sweated when humidity rose, it survived on cheap membership fees and its convenient location near the financial district. The equipment was outdated, the trainers half-interested, but the monthly rate was something I could afford on my editor's salary. And after my divorce, I needed somewhere to channel the restless energy that kept me awake at night. I preferred working out late, arriving around 8:30 p.m. when the after-work crowd had thinned. The gym closed at 10 o'clock, giving me just enough time to complete my routine before the staff began their not-so-subtle hints that they wanted to lock up. The basement locker room became my private sanctuary those last 15 minutes. Most members avoided showering there, preferring to head home instead. The locker room's design was a relic from another era. A narrow corridor led past rows of dented metal lockers to a shower area with cracked tiles and inconsistent water pressure. Halfway down this corridor stood an enormous wall-mounted mirror, easily 7 feet tall and 5 feet wide, its ornate brass frame incongruously grand against the utilitarian surroundings. Management had probably salvaged it from somewhere else in the building during a long-ago renovation. The mirror's surface had that wavy quality common to old glass, subtly distorting reflections in a way that modern mirrors don't pactions to in reflections. It was the Tuesday after Labor Day when I first noticed something amiss. I'd just finished an intense session on the squat rack and was alone in the locker room, toweling off sweat before heading to the shower. As I opened my locker, I caught movement in the mirror's periphery, a dark smudge passing behind my reflected self. My head snapped around, heart suddenly racing, but the corridor behind me was empty. I turned back to the mirror, scanning its surface carefully. Near the right edge, a slight discoloration marred the glass, like a smear of something dark, or perhaps just a shadow cast at an odd angle. I reached out, running my fingers over the spot. It felt smooth and cool, just like the rest of the mirror. The rational explanation was dirt, a poorly cleaned mirror in a basement that hadn't seen proper maintenance in decades. I mentioned it offhandedly to Miguel, the night attendant, as I left. He nodded distractedly, promising to have someone look at it tomorrow. We both knew nobody would. A week passed before I noticed anything unusual again. I was alone once more, the gym nearly empty as closing time approached. Standing before the mirror, adjusting my gym bag, I felt a sudden cold spot, as if walking through a pocket of frigid air in an otherwise room temperature space. The chill raised goosebumps along my arms and the back of my neck. And then, at the edge of my vision, that same dark smudge seemed to move, expanding slightly before retreating to the mirror's edge. My breath caught. I stared hard at the spot, willing it to move again, to confirm what I had seen. Nothing happened, but as I leaned closer to examine the glass, my reflected face appeared somehow different, the eyes a fraction too wide, the mouth set in an expression I wasn't consciously making. For just a moment, I experienced the disorienting sensation of looking at a stranger wearing my face. I backed away, gathered my things, and left without showering. Over the next few weeks, I considered switching gyms, but financial constraints and stubbornness kept me returning. I changed my routine slightly, trying to finish earlier, but inevitably found myself alone in that basement corridor as closing time approached. And each time, the phenomena grew more pronounced. The dark smudge began appearing more frequently, no longer just at the mirror's edge, but sometimes sliding across its surface while I changed or showered. The temperature drops became more dramatic. On one occasion, my exhaled breath actually fogged in the suddenly frigid air. Most disturbing were the subtle differences in my reflection movements that lagged by milliseconds, expressions that didn't quite match my own, a sense that what I was seeing wasn't quite in sync with reality. When I finally mentioned these occurrences to Miguel, his reaction was predictably dismissive. He reluctantly accompanied me to the locker room where, of course, nothing unusual happened. Standing beside me, he peered into the mirror and saw only what should be there, two men in a dingy basement. He suggested with poorly concealed impatience that perhaps I was overtraining or needed more sleep. The lighting down here was bad, he reminded me, always playing tricks on people. But I knew what I had seen, what I continued to see when no one else was present. I began researching the building's history. Downtown Mercantile Bank had constructed it in 1908, and it had housed various businesses over the decades before becoming a fitness center in the late 92nd. The basement had served many purposes: storage, file room, even briefly as a small employee cafeteria in the 62nd. Nothing in the public record suggested tragedy or death that might explain a haunting, if that's what this was. October arrived, bringing earlier sunsets and a perpetual chill to the basement locker room. My encounters with whatever lurked in the mirror grew more intense. One evening, while showering, I distinctly heard whispers emanating from the drain too faint to discern words, but unmistakably human in cadence. When I hurriedly shut off the water and grabbed my towel, I found footprints on the floor leading from the mirror to the shower stall, damp impressions that couldn't be mine because they approached from the wrong direction. They evaporated as I watched, leaving no trace except my accelerated heartbeat and the cold sweat that had nothing to do with my workout. That night, my sleep was plagued by dreams of the mirror. In my nightmare, I approached it endlessly down a corridor that stretched longer with each step. My reflection waited patiently, growing more distinct as I struggled to reach it. But the face looking back wasn't mine, or rather, it was mine, but wrong, like a photographic negative, with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched too wide in a grimace masquerading as a smile. I woke gasping, sheets damp with sweat, the bedside clock displaying 3:33 a.m. For several minutes, I sat upright, convincing myself there was no mirror in my bedroom, no watching presence in the darkened corners. When sleep finally reclaimed me, it was thin and restless, The next day, I asked Diane, the morning manager who'd worked at the gym since its opening, about the mirror. Her response was unexpected. She paused, keys jingling in her hand, and asked why I wanted to know. There was something guarded in her expression that hadn't been there before. I kept my explanation vague, just curious about such an ornate piece in an otherwise utilitarian space. Diane revealed that the mirror had been there when they took over the building, too heavy and cumbersome to move. She'd wanted to remove it during renovations, but the owner had insisted on leaving it. Something about architectural integrity or historical preservation. She hurried away after that, suddenly remembering an appointment. She was lying. I was certain of it. That evening, I purposely arrived later than usual. The gym was nearly empty, just a couple of regulars finishing half-hearted sets before heading home. Miguel was nowhere to be seen, unusual since he was typically stationed near the entrance at this hour. I completed an abbreviated workout. My attention focused more on the approaching solitude than on proper form or rep counts. By 9:45, I was alone. The overhead speakers announced 15 minutes until closing, the automated message echoing through empty rooms. I descended the stairs to the basement, each step heavier than the last. Some irrational part of me hoped that confronting whatever dwelt in the mirror might end this escalating situation. Another part recognized the foolishness of intentionally seeking out something I didn't understand. The locker room corridor seemed darker than usual. Two of the fluorescent tubes had failed, leaving pools of shadow between islands of harsh light. The air felt thicker, more resistant, as if the oxygen percentage had subtly decreased. And it was cold, much colder than the autumn night outside warranted. Standing before the mirror, I saw only my ordinary reflection at first, a middle-aged man with tension evident in the set of his shoulders and the tightness around his eyes. I waited, breathing carefully, watching for any anomaly. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Just as I began to feel foolish, ready to chalk up my experiences to overwork and an active imagination, the fluorescent light directly overhead flickered and went out. The mirror's surface darkened, and in that moment of semi-darkness, my reflection changed. It was still recognizably me, but the eyes now held an emotion. I wasn't feeling a malicious amusement that sent adrenaline coursing through my system. As I stared, paralyzed, my reflection's head tilted slightly, a movement I hadn't made. Its lips parted in the suggestion of a smile. The light above sputtered back to life, and the reflection normalized. But I had seen enough. This wasn't imagination or a trick of light. Whatever looked back at me from that glass wasn't me, at least not entirely. I backed away, heart hammering against my ribs, mouth dry with fear. My reflected counterpart matched my movements perfectly now, the momentary divergence apparently over. But I knew what I had seen. The basement speakers crackled with the 10-minute warning. I should leave. Every instinct screamed to run from this place and never return. Instead, I found myself stepping closer to the mirror, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. "What are you?" My voice emerged as a hoarse whisper. My reflection mouthed the same words, synchronized once more. But then, as I watched, a subtle change rippled across its features. The eyes darkened, the pupils expanding until little iris remained. The head tilted again, that not quite natural angle, suggesting curiosity, or perhaps predatory assessment. Behind my reflection, the dark smudge I'd noticed weeks ago expanded, spreading like spilled ink across the mirror's surface. It no longer resembled a shadow or stain, but something three-dimensional that existed behind the glass, extending outward as it grew. The temperature plummeted. My breath clouded before me in short, panicked bursts. The overhead lights flickered again, and in that strobing effect, I saw my reflection step backward while I remained frozen in place. The distance between us increased with each flicker until my doppelganger stood fully 5 feet behind where it should be, receding into a space that couldn't exist. It raised one hand in a gesture that might have been farewell or invitation. The darkness behind it consolidated, taking vague form, a suggestion of height, of mass, of limbs that moved wrong. Whatever it was, it dwarfed my reflection, enveloping it partially in what might have been an embrace or consumption. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on the uneven floor. The fall saved me. As I crashed to the ground, my gaze broke from the mirror. The spell of paralysis shattered with the eye contact. I scrambled up and ran, dignity forgotten in the flight response that overrode all other concerns. Behind me, the temperature normalized with each step I took away from the mirror. By the time I reached the stairs, I felt only the usual basement chill rather than the bone-deep cold of moments before. Miguel stood at the front desk, eyebrows rising at my disheveled appearance, and the fact that I still wore my workout clothes, gym bag clutched in white-knuckled hands. He asked if everything was all right. I mumbled something about not feeling well and hurried past, unwilling to explain, or perhaps unable to find words that wouldn't sound deranged. I didn't return to the gym for a week. During that time, I researched mirrors in folklore and urban legends, finding countless stories of mirrors as portals or traps for spirits. Most cultures had some taboo or superstition regarding mirrors and darkness. None of it helped me understand what was happening at Elite Fitness, but it confirmed I wasn't alone in fearing what might lurk behind reflective surfaces. When I finally returned, it was midday, the gym crowded with lunch break warriors and retirees using their discounted daytime memberships. I avoided the basement entirely, using the small restroom near the entrance instead. But as my workout ended, I found myself drawn downstairs by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The locker room was occupied, this time 2 men changing after their workouts, their conversation about protein supplements echoing off the tiled walls. I positioned myself to keep the mirror in view while I changed, watching for any abnormality. With others present, the glass remained just glass, my reflection behaving as it should. As the men left, one of them nodded to me in passing. I nearly grabbed his arm, nearly begged him to stay. Instead, I watched them disappear up the stairs, leaving me alone once more with the mirror. The familiar cold descended immediately, as if it had been waiting just beyond the threshold of perception. My reflected self looked back at me, eyes dark and knowing, a slight smile playing at lips that I could feel remained pressed in a grim line on my actual face. "What do you want?" I whispered. The reflection's smile widened. Behind it, the darkness gathered again, taking more substantial form than before. It suggested a human silhouette, but wrong proportions exaggerated, limbs too numerous, or too long. It loomed over my doppelganger with what I could only interpret as possessive intent. My reflection's lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but somehow I understood. Recognize. Company. Release. Asterisk. The overhead light flickered, and my reflection retreated further into the impossible space behind the glass. One hand extended toward me, palm up, in unmistakable invitation. Behind it, the darkness parted like a curtain, revealing glimpses of a place that wasn't a place, a void, punctuated by fragments of what might have been other rooms, other mirrors, other trapped observers. I understood then. The mirror wasn't haunted. It was a door, and whatever had assumed my likeness was a gatekeeper, seeking to draw me through. I backed away, shaking my head. My reflection's expression hardened, the simulated humanity dropping away to reveal something ancient and patient and hungry. The darkness behind it surged forward, pressing against the glass like a membrane about to rupture. The mirror's surface rippled actual physical movement, distorting its reflective plane. A sound filled the room, not heard with ears, but felt in bone and tissue, a subsonic vibration that rattled fillings and set nerve endings alight with pain. I ran. Up the stairs, past startled staff, out into the street, where I gulped fresh air in desperate lungfuls. I never returned to Elite Fitness after that day, forfeited my membership, abandoned my locker contents, ignored the automated emails asking why I'd left. Sometimes, passing reflective surfaces store windows, car mirrors, even my phone's darkened screen, I catch movement at the periphery of my vision. A familiar silhouette, watching, waiting for recognition or invitation. I've covered the mirrors in my apartment, learned to shave by touch rather than sight, because I know what waits on the other side of the glass. And I know that each time I meet those eyes, the barrier between us wears thinner. One day, perhaps, no mirror will be needed at all. Until then, I avoid my reflection and try not to think about that other self waiting in the darkness beyond the mirror's edge. Sometimes, though, I wonder if I made the right choice. If what looked back at me from that basement mirror was truly malevolent or merely different. If the darkness it offered was oblivion or transformation. And in those moments of doubt, when my guard is lowest, I feel it watching, patient, eternal, certain that eventually curiosity will overcome caution. After all, we're reflections of each other, and mirrors don't forget the faces they've shown. These entities are not just random noises or reflections. Some have a purpose, a lingering agenda tied to their past, or a desire to claim something that was once theirs. But what happens when that something is you? When the horror finds a reason to latch on to your very identity? Some terrors aren't just about jump scares or dark shadows. Some are about identity. What if the very fabric of your existence, your job, your place in the world, was being questioned by something that claims it was there first? What if the past wasn't just history, but a presence with unfinished business, and your asterisk standing in its way? We've journeyed through the unsettling whispers that begin in the periphery, seen our safe havens become battlegrounds, and watched as public spaces revealed their hidden horrors. Now, we dive into the chilling realm where the past isn't just history, but a persistent presence, determined to reclaim what it believes is its own. Our first journey takes us to the unassuming halls of WKRP radio station, where the voice you hear might not be the one you expect. Daniel Mercer, an unassuming night host, found solace in the quiet hum of the studio after dark. But that solitude quickly turned into something far more sinister. It started subtly, the way these things often do. A phantom echo of his own footsteps down a deserted hall. A sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature. The distinct sound of a throat clearing directly behind him in an empty studio. As the incidents escalated, objects shifting when his back was turned, notes rearranging themselves, a coffee mug appearing on the wrong shelf, Daniel's initial disbelief gave way to a chilling certainty. Something else was sharing his space, a presence that observed his every move. His night technician, Marco, initially dismissed Daniel's growing paranoia until he too felt the subtle shifts, the prickling sensation of being watched. Their investigation, a desperate attempt to cling to rationality, led them to old news archives. What they found chilled them to the bone. Decades ago, a previous night host, Richard Carlson, had died in a broadcasting accident in that very studio. Suddenly, the phantom throat clearing wasn't just a sound. It was a prelude to communication. During a late-night broadcast, as Daniel sat alone, the studio air growing impossibly cold, a voice, raspy and static-filled, broke the silence. Not from the airwaves, but from the empty space beside him. "You've taken my place," it rasped. the words echoing not just in the room, but in Daniel's very soul. The accusation was unmistakable, a possessive claim to the microphone, the studio, the identity of the night host. The horror here isn't about being chased, it's about existential usurpation. What defines a life, after all, if not the work you do, the role you play? And what happens when that role is still occupied by someone who refuses to let go, even in death? Richard Carlson, it seemed, was still very much on the air. From the spectral airwaves of a radio station, we shift to the sterile, fluorescent-lit world of Crawford and Associates accounting. Here, our protagonist, a man of numbers and logic, found his orderly existence crumbling as the very records of his life began to contradict reality. For years, the solitude of late nights in the office had been his comfort, the quiet hum of computers, the satisfying click of keyboards. But then came the footsteps in empty corridors, the ringing of a disconnected phone line that whispered subtle static and the chilling playback of his own voice, phrases he'd spoken hours earlier. "Hello? Who is this?" he'd asked, only to hear his own words echo back. Then, a new distorted voice, like something from underwater, broke through. "The number's wrong." A profound, unsettling statement in an accountant's world. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a re-auditing of reality. The entity began manipulating his computer, the cursor moving on its own, typing digits that were eerily familiar. The last 4 of his social security number. Then came an email from an impossible address, its subject line the same 4 digits. Driven by a desperate need for a logical explanation, the accountant began his own investigation. His search led him to a forgotten storage box, labeled with those same 4 digits. Inside, he found a shocking document, an employee termination form for him, dated 7 years prior, with a chilling reason listed: deceased, workplace accident. Attached was a faded newspaper clipping detailing his own death. The horror wasn't just that a ghost was in the machine. It was that he was the ghost, or at least, a ghost in the making. The numbers were indeed wrong, twisting the very foundation of his existence. He was a living man, yet the records claimed he was dead. This wasn't a spirit trying to communicate. It was a spirit trying to become him, or perhaps remind him of a truth he had somehow forgotten. The question wasn't if something was haunting the office, but if he was the one being haunted by his own forgotten past. Finally, we arrive at Meridian Financial, where the concept of a shared cubicle takes on a terrifying, uncanny dimension. For 3 years, our financial analyst worked in his cubicle, oblivious to the spectral coworker he unknowingly possessed. It started subtly, with his chair rolling back on its own, the faint click of a mouse from an empty desk, the rapid, ghostly tapping of keys on a powered-down keyboard. He dismissed it as electrical glitches, or his overactive imagination, a common refuge for the rational mind facing the impossible. But the phenomena persisted, intensifying, always clustering around his section, the air growing colder, objects subtly rearranging themselves. They were deliberate, meticulous changes, as if someone was fine-tuning his workspace, adjusting for comfort. Then came the chilling message on his computer screen, a document he never created, typed in his name: "I need to finish what was started." The unraveling began. Through his own investigation, a desperate dive into the company's past, he uncovered the story of Walter Grimm, an employee who, 15 years prior, had been laid off from that very cubicle, only to disappear without a trace. "They replaced me. They'll replace you too." Grimm's spectral message typed itself onto the screen. A chilling prophecy, a warning. But then came an offer. "We're all temporary here," Walter typed. I'm still working. I just need somewhere to work. It was an invitation, a proposition for a hauntingly productive partnership. An agreement was forged. Walter would work after hours, the human during the day. His productivity soared, his error rate dropped to zero, promotions loomed. His cubicle, once a place of quiet dread, became a place of uncanny collaboration. It leaves us with the unsettling thought: some jobs might never truly end, and some colleagues may prove to be eternal. From the subtle to the shocking, from our homes to our workplaces, we've seen how the veil can thin, how entities with a purpose can cling to their pasts, their identities, their unfinished tasks. But what happens when that purpose shifts? When the something they want isn't a place or a job, but you? When the place-bound horror becomes a personal pursuit, following you wherever you go, demanding an answer or an invitation? We've journeyed through homes, offices, and public spaces, witnessing the terrifying moments when the unseen becomes undeniable. But what happens when the horror isn't confined to a place or a purpose? What happens when it sees you and decides you're next? When the only way out is to give in or to run forever? In this final chilling chapter, we delve into stories where the entities transcend their original locations, actively pursuing their chosen victims, turning entire lives into a continuous nightmare. It's the profound sense of helplessness when you realize that once noticed, some things simply do not let go. Consider the chilling case of Apartment 3B, which we touched upon earlier. Our narrator, driven from his home by the relentless, pacing footsteps of what he thought was an upstairs neighbor, sought refuge miles away. But the footsteps followed. Every night, at precisely 11:07 p.m., he would wake, drenched in cold sweat, to the sound of heavy, deliberate steps pacing directly above him, even in a motel where there was no upstairs. The horror wasn't bound to the old building. It was bound to him. He realized, with a creeping dread, that whatever walked those floors had chosen him, and now his ceiling was its floor, wherever he went. The violation of sanctuary transformed into an inescapable pursuit, blurring the lines between sanity and a terrifying new reality. How do you escape something that literally follows you across state lines, a constant, invisible weight pressing down on your very existence? Then there's the chilling account from the Blackwell Avenue print shop. Our protagonist, Daniel, had sensed a malevolent presence lurking in the vacant storefront next door, a shadow that lived in the space of between. It communicated through subtle movements and scratches, always just beyond sight. But the horror escalated when it began to breach that liminal space, manifesting as a tall, thin silhouette, capable of assuming familiar forms. The most terrifying revelation came when it mirrored the face of the previous tenant, Howard Keller, a man who had vanished after being tormented by the same entity. Daniel fled, abandoning his business, crossing the country to escape. Yet, in moments between wakefulness and sleep, in the periphery of his vision, he still glimpses a familiar silhouette, watching, waiting. The shadow entity, a creature of the gaps and forgotten corners, had found him, and once it notices you, it never truly lets go. It merely bides its time, ready to remind you that you, too, might become another shadow on its wall. Can you ever truly be free from something that can mimic human form and cross any distance, living in the very spaces of absence around you? The Watcher of the Loom from the Westbrook Textile Mill offers a different, yet equally horrifying, form of pursuit. Our narrator, an architect, sensed an ancient presence within the abandoned mill during his nightly runs, a figure woven of threads, silently observing. His curiosity led him inside, where he saw a terrifying tapestry depicting the mill, with faceless figures watching. The Watcher revealed itself, a being of tightly woven fibers pursuing him through the dark, decaying building. Even after fleeing, changing his route, and moving to another city, he finds single, blue-green threads on his pillow. The mill, or rather, what resides within it, is reaching out, weaving him into its pattern, one strand at a time. The previous missing workers weren't fired or resigned. They were incorporated, thread by living thread, into something larger, something still growing, still creating. The chilling question here isn't just about escape, but about identity. Can you resist becoming a part of something that seeks to unravel your very being and reweave you into its monstrous design? And finally, the most profound and existential terror of all, the entity from the Grayson University sub-basement archives. Our protagonist, Professor Daniel Mercer, stumbled upon something ancient and powerful, dwelling in the geological and historical convergence point beneath the university library. It communicated through whispers, manipulating the environment, offering forbidden knowledge for an invitation, a small tear in the veil. This wasn't a malicious ghost, but a being from an adjacent reality, seeking access, connection, and a way to share its boundless, terrifying insights. Grayson, a professor from the 1802nd, had given the invitation and regretted it. Daniel chose to refuse, to run from the promise of academic immortality. But the entity, enraged, pursued him, collapsing shelves, screaming his name, telling him he couldn't escape knowledge once offered. He managed to flee, but the question lingers. Was his choice truly an escape, or merely a postponement? This entity highlights the ultimate form of being chosen, not just to be haunted, but to be offered a terrifying partnership, a chance to transcend human understanding at an unimaginable cost. Are we ever truly free from what finds us? Especially when what finds us promises to make us more than we are, to reveal truths we were never meant to comprehend. These stories converge on one terrifying truth. Some horrors aren't content to merely exist in the dark corners of our world. Some actively seek us out. They watch, they wait, and then they choose. And once you are chosen, once you have been noticed, the true nightmare begins. Because the space between your world and theirs thins, the whispers become clearer, and the pursuit becomes relentless. It's not about jump scares or dark shadows anymore. It's about the erosion of your reality, the shattering of your safe spaces, and the realization that the entity has a purpose, an agenda, and you are now an integral part of it. The question isn't whether you can run, but where you can go when the horror is no longer outside your door, but an echo in your very soul. So, as you turn off the lights tonight, as the shadows deepen in your own room, remember these stories. Remember that feeling of being watched, that subtle shift in the air. Because sometimes those aren't just feelings, they are recognitions. And perhaps they've been watching you for much longer than you think, waiting for the perfect moment to extend their own invitation. What will you do when it's your turn to be chosen?